you are blindfolded. Your wrists are bound with rough cords soaked in wine. Your naked feet step onto cold stone, and your shoulder brushes against another body warm, trembling. You do not speak, neither does he. A distant drum begins to throb, slow, steady, like a heartbeat. Then, a voice low, masculine, chanting in a language you do not understand. The others respond. You are led forward. The blindfold is removed. You stand beneath a vaulted ceiling, deep underground. Candles line the walls. In front of you, a fresco of a man slaying a bull bleeds red paint down the stone. Mithras, the invincible one, the torchbearer, the guardian of secrets. All around you, men young, strong, silent form a circle. Some are marked with ash, others wear masks of animals. The air smells of sweat, smoke, and frankincense. You were told this would be a rite of strength, of brotherhood. But no one warned you about this part. The man behind you places his hand on your back. Another kneels before you and presses his forehead to your belly. Then, silence. You hear the leader's voice again. Let what is hidden remain hidden. Let the sacred be reborn in flesh. Let man become more than man. And then they begin. No records survive of what exactly happened in those caverns. No Roman historian dared commit the details to ink. The men who participated swore eternal silence. Those who broke their vows vanished. Or worse. But we have fragments, graffiti, mosaics, a handful of cryptic inscriptions, enough to glimpse what happened behind the veils of the Roman Empire's most secretive cult's rites, where sex, blood, and spiritual ecstasy merged into one. This is not the Rome you learned in school. This is not about emperors, legions, or law. This is the Rome of initiation chambers, veiled orgies, and homoerotic devotion masquerading as divine transcendence. This is the world of Mithras, Bacchus, and the dozens of cults that flourished in the empire's shadows. Before we continue, if you enjoy learning about the dark and forgotten chapters of history, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps us create more content like this. Now, let's begin with the hidden spiritual infrastructure of Roman mystery cults, a system built on secrecy, maintained by fear, and remembered only in fragments. The cult of Mithras, for instance, left behind over 600 subterranean temples scattered from Syria to Britannia. No women allowed. Initiates underwent 7 levels of advancement, each more brutal than the last. The first required a symbolic death. The final required absolute submission. But it was not just Mithras. The followers of Bacchus Dionysus to the Greeks held rituals so wild, so uncontainably, that the Roman Senate banned them outright in 186 BCE. Authorities cited public disorder, unlawful assemblies, uncontrolled lust, but the real reason was whispered, never written. Men entering as citizens, and emerging as something else, bound not by law, but by ecstatic surrender. And beyond even Bacchus were the lesser-known cults, the devotees of Ates who castrated themselves in frenzy, the priests of Isis who held midnight processions by torchlight, the Galli who danced in feminine garb, neither fully male nor female, invoking divine union through erotic inversion. Each had their own gods, their own masks, but the rituals shared a logic. To become divine, one must be undone. Modern scholars dance around the implications. They use terms like symbolic intimacy or metaphysical brotherhood. They downplay the physicality. They censor the desire, but ancient inscriptions tell a different story. In the Temple of Mithras at Capua, a graffiti reads Felix sum. Frater meo samavit. I am blessed. My brother loved me. In Pompeii, a painting shows 2 male initiates reclining on a couch, wine spilling from one's lips to the other's chest. Below them, a priest holds a bull's heart, bleeding. These were not isolated events. They were ritual, they were sacred, and they were deliberate. To the Romans, sexuality was not about identity. It was about dominance, submission, power, and transformation. Within the mystery cults, these principles were elevated, consecrated, worshipped, but only for those who could bear the price. You did not join the cult of Mithras for status. You joined to be broken, to shed the skin of a Roman citizen and be reborn in secrecy, to be possessed by something older than law, to be touched by the divine in the flesh of another man. They called it initiatio. They called it sacramentum. They called it rebirth. But in truth, it was something far more carnal, and it begins, always, in silence, in darkness, with the brush of a hand across your spine, and the quiet voice that says, "You are one of us now." The Roman Empire was a world of spectacle. Temples towered above cities, forums bustled with trade and politics, and colosseums roared with blood. Public life was everything. Power was visible. Rituals were civic, but beneath that surface, behind the marble and the law, there pulsed another Rome, quiet, smoky, subterranean. A Rome of secrets. This was the world of the mystery cults. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had absorbed vast swathes of the Mediterranean, bringing with it not just people and resources, but religions. Dozens of foreign gods were folded into the imperial pantheon. Mithras from Persia, Isis from Egypt, Cybele from Anatolia, Dionysus from Greece. Each offered something the official Roman state religion could not. Mystery, ecstasy, transformation. Unlike the state rituals, which were performed publicly by magistrates in togas, the mystery cults operated in private, often in underground chambers. Initiation was not automatic by birth. It was earned, through suffering, through secrecy. At their core, mystery religions promised more than prosperity. They offered salvation, but not a Christian kind of salvation. Not yet. The salvation of Mithras, of Bacchus, of Attis, was bodily, visceral, a death and rebirth enacted through ritual. Blood was often spilled, wine was consumed in excess, clothing was torn. Ecstasy was achieved not through prayer, but through the dissolution of self. For Roman men raised in a world of rigid hierarchies where masculinity was defined by control, restraint, and domination, the cults offered inversion, the chance to be unmade. In the mainstream Roman religious system, the divine was bureaucratic. You performed your sacrifices, said the proper words, and expected the gods to do their part. There was no intimacy, no passion, but in the mystery cults, the divine touched you. It entered your body, sometimes literally. The cult of Bacchus, imported from Greece as the worship of Dionysus, centered around the idea of mania, divine madness. Followers would drink, dance, whip themselves into frenzy, and abandon all sense of self. In this frenzy, boundaries dissolved between man and God, man and woman, man and man. This was not metaphor. Inscriptions, artworks, and fragments of Roman accusations describe rituals that blurred gender and upended social norms. In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate issued the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, a decree banning Bacchic rituals across Italy. The official reasons were sedition, criminal conspiracy, and moral decay. But the decree also references debauched nocturnal assemblies, and the mixing of men with men. A rare surviving transcript of a Senate inquiry states that in these rites, the young are corrupted by older men under the guise of divine revelation. The text is careful to couch the accusations in political terms, but the undertone is clear. The cults were seen as a threat, not just because of their secrecy, but because they undermined Roman masculinity. Roman gender roles were tightly codified. A man was expected to be dominant sexually, socially, legally. Penetration was an act of power. To be penetrated was to be feminine, subordinate, and thus un-Roman. But within these mystery religions, those roles could be reversed, and the state did not tolerate reversal. Mithraism, by contrast, managed to avoid persecution. Its rituals were secretive but highly disciplined. It appealed to soldiers, bureaucrats, and merchants. There were no women, only men, only initiates. Each level of Mithraic initiation: raven, bridegroom, soldier, lion, Persian, sunrunner, and father required submission to the group. Trials of silence, tests of endurance, symbolic deaths, and in some regions, acts of intimate submission framed as divine bonding. The term pater, used for the highest Mithraic initiates, was not just metaphorical. In many Mithraea, inscriptions refer to sons of the pater, suggesting a hierarchical and possibly sexual mentorship that echoed Roman household structures. In Ostia, a temple wall reads, "Pater Flavius initiated me with warmth and truth. In his embrace I was reborn." This is not Christian language. This is older, fleshly, pagan. Scholars like Martin Vermeseren and Roger Beck argue that the Mithraic liturgy involved close physical contact, possibly erotic, as part of symbolic death and rebirth. The blood of the sacred bull, the tauroctony, may have been poured or smeared on the initiate's body, or another man's body may have stood in for that divine flesh. But the most direct window into these practices comes from the fringe cults. The Galli, priests of the Phrygian goddess Cybele, were biologically male but presented as female. During initiation, they would castrate themselves in public ritual, often during spring festivals, and live thereafter in feminine attire. The act was not seen as shameful. It was holy. The Roman state tolerated them. Barely. They were mocked, feared, sometimes attacked, but they were not forbidden. In their madness, they channeled the divine. The cult of Isis, too, featured processions where men dressed as women danced in ecstasy and bathed in Nile water at night. These events blurred gender, blurred roles. They made the body a vessel for the gods, because for many Romans, especially those at the fringes of power, or those alienated by rigid social norms, divinity could only be reached by becoming other. To be divine was to surrender, to bleed, to kneel, to love another man and call it sacred. These were not isolated heresies. They were entire systems of belief, ritualized, repeated, protected, and always hidden. In a world where law and order were enforced by iron and stone, the cults offered something softer, something darker, a secret initiation not into citizenship, but into transformation. Not all joined for pleasure, not all survived, but those who entered the caves of Mithras, the groves of Bacchus, or the chambers of Cybele, did so with the knowledge that they would never be the same again. They would return to Rome changed, eyes downcast, bodies marked, and in their silence, the empire endured. No witnesses, no official records, only fragments. That is what remains of the rituals of Rome's mystery cults, designed to disappear. But fragments speak. They whisper through murals half-worn by soot. They echo in inscriptions carved into temple walls hidden beneath layers of ash and centuries. They survive in the accusations of Roman prosecutors, in the fevered writings of Christian polemicists, and in the careful, uncomfortable evasions of modern historians. From these broken shards, a picture begins to form, not complete, but vivid. We begin in the Mithraeum. The initiation chamber of the Mithraic cult was deliberately fashioned like a cave, long, narrow, with a vaulted ceiling and 2 stone benches lining the walls. The Tauroctony, the central image of Mithras slaying the cosmic bull, dominated the apse. At first glance, it is a scene of heroism, but beneath it, symbolic layers unfold. The bull is not just an animal. It is life. It is flesh. Its blood brings the world into being. Its death is your rebirth. New initiates would lie on the ground beneath a grated platform. Above them, the priest would sacrifice a bull or, more commonly, perform a symbolic act using blood or wine. The liquid would drip down onto the initiate's naked body. This was called the taurobolium. Contemporary sources like Prudentius describe the initiate as washed in the blood of the divine beast, trembling, weeping, eyes wide with the knowing of death. It was not merely a spectacle, it was a submission. From there, the initiate was raised naked, shivering, smeared and embraced by his father, the Mithraic high priest. Inscriptions and artwork suggest that the embrace was not always symbolic. In the Mithraeum beneath Santa Prisca in Rome, a wall painting shows a procession of men, some carrying torches, others wearing animal masks. In one panel, a younger man kneels before an older figure holding a staff. The kneeling man is nude. The standing figure's hand rests on his shoulder. Behind them, another figure holds a bowl, out of which pours a red stream. The image is crude, but the meaning is clear. These were not mere rites of allegiance. They were rites of surrender. The cult of Bacchus was less restrained. Dionysian mysteries emphasized frenzy, disorientation, and ecstasy. Rituals were held in forests, in remote groves, or in torchlit villas far from the gaze of the Senate. Music, dancing, drumming, these were used to break the rational mind. Participants often wore masks, of animals, of gods, to become something else, to forget who they were. Pliny the Elder describes how during Bacchic rites, the senses were drowned in wine, the body overtaken with rhythm, and the boundaries between men fell away. Men kissed, touched, fell together. The language used in surviving descriptions is always indirect, but the implications are not. Lucius Accius, a Roman poet writing in the 2nd century BCE, wrote a line later cited by Christian critics. In Bacchus's grove, all are women, all receive. The idea was not about gender, it was about transcendence. To receive the god, one had to become receptive. The Romans had no modern category for this, but they feared it. In the Bacchanalia, it was not uncommon for the initiate to be led blindfolded into the center of a circle. Wine would be poured over his head. He would be stripped, crowned with ivy, and asked to confess his sins, not moral transgressions, but the sins of forgetting the god. Then came the dance, spinning, clapping, laughing until collapse, until the body was no longer governed by the mind, until it opened. Sexual acts were never named, only implied, but statues remain. One in Naples shows 2 male figures reclining, their hands joined, one with his head on the other's chest. Between them lies a thyrsus, the sacred Dionysian staff, tipped with a pine cone, symbol of both fertility and pain. Then there were the rites of Attis and Cybele. On the Day of Blood, known as Dies Sanguinis, the galley priests of the goddess would enter a state of ecstatic frenzy. Drums would beat, flutes would wail. In the center of the square, watched by crowds, a man would step forward. He would shout the goddess's name, then raise a blade, and castrate himself. Blood was smeared on the altar, the organs buried. The man, now a woman in body and role, was crowned and embraced by his fellow priests. Those who survived the mutilation were considered reborn. But what happened after? Galley lived in communal houses. They dressed in long robes, wore jewelry, painted their faces. Roman commentators alternated between fascination and revulsion. Juvenal, in one of his satires, speaks of men who kiss like women, who lie like wives, who say they serve the goddess but serve themselves. And yet, they were priests. Their rituals endured, their presence tolerated. In certain rites, young men were chosen to be lovers of the goddess. They would undergo purification, fasting, and then be paired with an older Gallus, who would prepare them for the presence of Cybele. The preparation is not explained, but in light of all else, it does not need to be. Then there were the isolated texts. A fragmentary papyrus found in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, mentions a rite called the Binding of Brotherhood. It describes two men, cloaked in purple, joining hands over a flame, then lying together in darkness. Another from Dura Europos speaks of the third gate, entered only by those who have shed blood, shared seed, and spoken no word. These were not metaphors. These were instructions. The goal was not pleasure. The goal was transformation. Through submission, through ritualized intimacy, through erasure of the individual, each cult offered a path. Each path required the body to be pierced, to be kissed, to be used, and in that use, the gods descended. You were no longer a Roman. You were no longer yourself. You were reborn. The Roman Empire was an engine of assimilation. It did not conquer simply with legions, but with culture, language, roads, coinage, and religion. Wherever Rome expanded, it absorbed, but absorption was never neutral. It meant control. The gods of conquered peoples were brought into the Roman pantheon, but always reframed, always restructured to serve the logic of empire. The mystery cults, however, defied that logic, and yet, Rome let them grow. Why? Because the cults did not oppose empire. They served it quietly, in the shadows. At first glance, the intimate, homoerotic rituals of Mithras or Bacchus seemed to contradict everything Roman power stood for. Control, patriarchy, military virtue, sexual dominance. But underneath, they mirrored Rome's own hierarchies. They sustained them. Consider Mithraism. Though its surface symbolism is drawn from Persian mythology, the cult of Mithras, as it existed in Rome, was a Roman creation reforged to appeal to soldiers, merchants, and mid-level administrators. The structure of the Mithraeum mimicked a Roman military encampment. The 7 grades of initiation reflected the ranks of command. But the true genius of Mithraism was its inversion. To rise in power within the cult, one had to undergo submission. A soldier who commanded men by day would kneel before a pater by night. A merchant who owned slaves would be blindfolded and led by the hand. A man who spoke in the Senate might be kissed on the mouth by a fellow initiate in darkness. Each ritual was a controlled breakdown of the Roman masculine ideal, only to rebuild it again, stronger. Within the cult's logic, this was not rebellion. It was refinement. Mithras offered Roman men a place to experience vulnerability without loss of status, to be penetrated symbolically, ritually, or literally, and then reassert their dominance within a closed hierarchy. It was a pressure valve, and Rome needed it. The empire was vast, impersonal, dehumanizing. Its laws were rigid, its punishments brutal, its expectations crushing. In such a world, the mystery cults provided a space for emotional intensity, for tactile connection, for surrender, and the state tolerated it, as long as the boundaries remained intact. The Bacchic rites pushed further, too far. The Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, issued in 186 BCE, was not simply about sexual behavior. It was about organization. The Senate feared that Bacchic initiates were forming horizontal networks of allegiance that bypassed the state's vertical chains of command. It was not the sex that terrified them. It was the secrecy, the solidarity. According to the decree, no man shall hold authority over more than 5 initiates. Assemblies of more than 3 were forbidden. Temples were to be dismantled, priests arrested. The logic was clear: keep the cult fragmented, prevent cohesion, because cohesion is power. And within these cults, power moved through the body. The initiate who submitted during ritual was bound to his pater. his priest, his lover. These were not flings, they were vows, oaths. The ancient equivalent of blood pacts. Sex was not a deviation, it was a mechanism. Through it, the initiate was remade. Through it, he proved loyalty. And in return, he was given status. Access. Brotherhood, the empire, for all its strength, could not offer that kind of intimacy. The cults did, even in the rites of Cybele, which seemed to reject Roman masculinity outright. There was structure. The Galli, those who castrated themselves, were not anarchists. They were functionaries. They performed festivals, guarded temples, advised elite women on spiritual matters. They had ranks, roles, responsibilities, and their public rejection of manhood made them useful. They absorbed the shame. They carried it so others did not have to. Roman masculinity was defined not by being male, but by never being seen to be feminine. The Galli created a visible, performative boundary. They stood at the edge, so that others could remain safely within. Their mutilation was not deviant. It was functional. The same logic applied to the homoerotic rituals in these cults. They were carefully structured, always hierarchical. The older priest initiated the younger man. The initiate submitted, not to pleasure, but to the system. The act was sacred because it reproduced the order of the divine. To penetrate was to channel the god. To receive was to embody the transformation. And once initiated, the man was no longer the same. But he also did not return to society as a woman, or as a slave. He returned as an insider, as one who knew. This insider status came with power. Inscriptions from Mithraea across the empire show that high-ranking initiates often went on to hold key military or administrative positions. Being a member of the cult was a mark of reliability, of discipline, of loyalty. Rome understood this, and so it tolerated the secrecy. It allowed the caves to remain. It let the rites continue, because in the end, the cults did not threaten the empire. They reproduced it, at the micro level, in the flesh, one body at a time. Each ritual was a rehearsal of Rome's logic hierarchy. Obedience, submission for the sake of power. Even the transgressions were calculated. It was never about liberation. It was about initiation. Even the most extreme rites, castration, bloodletting, public ecstasy, fit into this pattern. They shocked. Yes, but they also transformed, and transformation was currency in the empire. A man who had died and been reborn in the cult was hardened. He could be trusted. He had no more secrets to keep except the cults. Thus the system sustained itself, not in opposition to Rome, but as its mirror, a dark reflection, hidden beneath the marble, soaked in wine, blood, and silence, where power was not shouted, but whispered, where brotherhood was sealed not by oath alone, but by the touch of flesh. They vanished, almost entirely. By the time the 4th century dawned, the empire that once tolerated these rituals began to erase them. With the rise of Christianity as a state religion, secrecy was no longer mysterious, it was heresy. Ecstasy was no longer divine, it was sin. And intimacy between men, once framed as sacred submission, was rebranded as perversion. The mystery cults were among the first casualties of Christian triumph. Mithraic temples were destroyed or repurposed. The once respected Galli were hunted and mocked. Bacchic rites disappeared into rumor. Their sacred objects, masks, thyrsi, ritual tools were buried, shattered, or confiscated by bishops. But the memory did not die cleanly. It decayed. Whispers remained. Graffiti on Roman bathhouse walls into the 5th century still reference initiation brothers. Christian sermons warn new converts to flee the shameful rites of false gods, where men lie with men, and call it rebirth. The church knew what had come before, and it feared how much of it still lingered. In late antiquity, religious polemicists like Augustine and Lactantius wrote bitterly about the softness of pagan rites. They described how young men were made to kneel, to receive blessings not from God, but from the lust of their priests. Their words drip with disgust, but also with familiarity. They knew these rites intimately because many of them had once participated. A common pattern emerges in conversion literature of the time: ex-initiate turned Christian zealot, confession of past indulgence, denunciation of old gods, a violent turn against former pleasures. The cults had not just shaped bodies, they had shaped identities, and when Christianity replaced the old rites, it did so by stealing their structure. Initiation, communion, confession, these were not invented from scratch. They were retooled. The early Christian church absorbed the machinery of the mystery religions. The architecture of cathedrals borrowed from the Mithraeum. The language of rebirth, blood, and body came directly from the Taurobolium and Bacchic frenzy. Even the idea of a sacred brotherhood bound by shared ritual and sacrifice was lifted from the cults that came before. But one element was deliberately discarded: erotic intimacy. What had once been central was now anathematized. The embrace between brothers, once part of ritual transformation, was reframed as unnatural. The touching of flesh became the touching of sin, and those who remembered otherwise were silenced or worse. By the 6th century, to even speak of the old rites was considered blasphemy. But you cannot fully erase a system so deeply woven into the fabric of empire. It leaves traces. In the margins of medieval manuscripts, scribes doodled 2 men in embrace beside the symbol of Mithras. In the poetry of the troubadours, we see veiled references to brotherhoods of blood and devotion. The concept of secret, male-only orders persisted, reframed, rebranded, but never forgotten. The Knights Templar, the Cathars, later, the Freemasons, all adopted ritual secrecy, hierarchical progression, and sacred oaths. Many preserved whispers of the body. Some were accused, rightly or wrongly, of homoerotic ritual, of kissing beneath the altar, of binding themselves in ways that went beyond fraternity. The same accusations once leveled at the Bacchantes and the Galli. Because history does not repeat, it echoes. Even in the present, echoes remain. The modern imagination remains fascinated with secret societies, with men bound together by ritual, with power exchanged not in public, but behind closed doors. Films, novels, conspiracy theories all return to this image: the candlelit room, the masked initiate, the unspeakable rite. What is it about that image that endures? Perhaps it is because these cults spoke to something primal, something outside the reach of law or language. They offered connection in a world of hierarchy, vulnerability in a culture of dominance, touch when touch was forbidden. And for queer people, especially queer men, this history is both a wound and a mirror. The homoerotic rituals of the mystery cults were not liberatory in the modern sense. They did not offer freedom. They offered transformation through submission. Pleasure was not the goal, it was the mechanism. Power still flowed top-down, but they created space. Space where male intimacy was not just permitted, but consecrated. In a world where such intimacy was otherwise constrained by law, status, and social expectation, these rites created sacred loopholes, temporary sanctuaries, a world within the world. That world has been lost, but the desire that created it, the longing for connection, for surrender, for being remade in another's hands, that remains. Even now, in the ruins of Mithraea, archaeologists find hand-carved symbols of joined hands, of intertwined bodies, of stars and flames and names etched side by side, not as lovers, as initiates, bound not by contract, but by ritual, not by law, but by flesh. It is tempting to romanticize this, to imagine the cults as queer havens in an ancient world, but that would be a lie. The truth is colder, stranger, more sacred and more brutal. Because these rituals were not made for comfort, they were made to transform, and transformation, in Rome, came at a cost. You are standing again in the chamber. The candles have long since burned out. The voices have faded. The stone is cold. You reach out in the dark and your hand touches nothing. Not the wall. Not another body. Not the shoulder of the man who once held you. The ritual is over. You are alone. But somewhere deep in the stone, there is still warmth. A memory. Perhaps. A residue. Because nothing that happened here was ever meant to survive. And yet, it did. The names are lost. The flesh has decayed. But the gestures remain etched into the walls of underground temples, whispered in the footnotes of censored texts, buried in the margins of history. And when you listen closely, you hear them. The gasp of the boy beneath the dripping altar, the quiet murmur of a vow spoken into another man's chest, the trembling exhale before the blade falls. They were not supposed to matter. They were not citizens, not martyrs, not even lovers. By Roman definitions, they were bodies, used, broken, reborn, and then forgotten. But some of them carved their stories in stone. In the Mithraeum of Capua, a scratched line reads, "I entered in silence. I left in fire. In Ostia he took my shame and called it divine. In a ruined temple beneath modern-day Budapest I bled for the god. But he came with the face of a man." These are not testimonies of faith. They are testimonies of survival. We do not know their real names. We cannot say what they felt. But we know they were there. They knelt. They bled. They touched and were touched. They became something else. And when they emerged, they carried the silence with them. What happened in those chambers was not freedom. It was not rebellion. It was ritualized undoing. But in that undoing, something strange and terrible occurred. Recognition. For a moment, one brief moment, a Roman man was allowed to break, to fall into another's arms, to cry out, not in battle or victory, but in ecstasy, in fear, in pain, and someone else was there to witness it. There is power in that, even when twisted by hierarchy, even when wrapped in the language of gods, even when remembered only in fragments, because at the heart of every mystery cult was not just a god. It was a body that suffered, that trembled, that received and gave, that remembered. The Roman Empire is gone, its laws are gone, its temples are dust, but the longing remains, not just for the divine, but for the moment when the divine came close, when it smelled like sweat and incense, when it pressed against your back in the dark, when it whispered your name. That longing survives, and sometimes, when we dream of mystery, of power, of brotherhood in the night, we are not dreaming new dreams, we are remembering old ones, dreams carved into stone beneath the earth, dreams so intimate, so forbidden, that they had to be called holy just to be spoken, and then silenced. They were not saints, they were not sinners, they were initiates, and for one night, beneath Rome, they were more than men,